Because I'm just talking out loud. Is, well, yeah.
So it's muted and I turned it down.
Question is how to get the traction within Microsoft.
Who pays attention to, and who will pay attention
So
to
who's
that?
Okay, I can see people, but everybody's muted. Hello?
Damien, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah.
Oh, it's one.
How do I make this not full screen? How do I make it full screen?
Damien, can you say something?
Yeah. Can you hear me at all? No?
Yep, there we go.
You can
Okay.
hear me now. Okay.
Yes, and so I'm going to make you the host. There you
Mhm.
go. Now you'll be able to share your screen.
Okay.
Do you see the screen, the share screen button?
I do. I'm just pulling that up. All right. Do you have my PowerPoint?
Nope. We do not. So I'm going to stop my share just in case.
Just froze. Okay. There you are.
Sorry about that. Okay.
That's all right. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. I'm going to hit the broadcast button. You know what? I made you the host. You do me a favor. Go in the participants list and right click on my user and tap make co-host.
Is make host or withdraw co-host permission?
Make host.
Host. Okay.
Make host. Okay, you're the host now. So perfect. That's what I needed. And we'll just give a few more minutes.
Although, are we broadcasting now?
We are broadcasting. People get started. That's fine.
By the way, because the meeting was on Monday. So I'll catch everybody.
Okay, we're going to get started in just a few minutes as folks jump on to this Microsoft DevOps user group live stream. We have a group here in Austin, and we also have a good number of people joining the live stream. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll give it just a minute or two and get everything set up, let you get settled, and then we'll get going.
So, Jeff,
Yes.
I tossed 2 links on your meetup page in the comments about 2 events that are coming to Austin that it might be, that folks might be interested. One is later this month, second one's in April.
Okay.
They're both Azure related, but. Wow.
News.
Web-based engagement is off.
I got your email 10 minutes ago telling me that we were having.
But it specifically target very, very large nonprofits.
Not this, like 1 month ago. Why do you need to come?
Do you not know it was beforehand?
No, I did. I was registered and I was planning to attend virtually. I had a meeting that was supposed to go till noon.
What we need to
Come down at
is
11:30.
to get development
Got in the car and
on the same page.
go down.
So we have a little bit of a.
I do appreciate y'all's help with the check that stuff, you know, that it probably pan out. So good.
Do you have a placement?
Right.
Yeah, they found another one. And actually, that's the reason what ended up happening was the Global Labs Bootcamp. One of the things that I put the link to in the chat.
All right, we're gonna get started, folks. You guys ready? You guys ready to rock? Okay. All right, Damon, are you ready to rock? We're muted.
I think I'd learn how to use these things by now, wouldn't you?
Right, exactly.
All right,
Can
let's
you,
get started then.
okay, let me welcome the group. So welcome everyone to the Microsoft DevOps user group. We're so excited to have Damian Brady here giving us our presentation. I also want to thank Microsoft for sponsoring the lunch for those of you on site here in Austin. And thank you to ClearMeasure for sponsoring the location. And we have some links as we're starting to use the meetup site more and more for local events. Sean Weisfeld posted some events here in Austin, so go check that out. And if anyone would like to host a gathering at their particular city where you essentially set up a video stream and you watch it together and then can discuss in a more local fashion, get in touch as we're setting up more live sites throughout the accessible time zones as we live stream. But really excited to get going. And thank you so much to Damian for being here today. Damian is a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. And before that, he was a mover and a shaker at Octopus Deploy as it rose in popularity. And he's going to be speaking to us today on DevOps best practices for Azure and VSTS. So Damian, it's all yours.
Awesome, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks everyone for having me. This is a live stream coming to you from Australia, where it is currently just a bit after 5 in the morning. So I have just been chugging coffee since I got up about an hour ago. So I'm going to talk to you today about DevOps best practices for Azure and VSTS. So first, a little bit about me. I'm a cloud developer advocate, as Jeffrey said. He also mentioned that I used to work for Octopus Deploy. And then before that, I worked in consulting. So I spent a lot of time at different companies trying to help them with their DevOps processes and agile processes, as well as cutting a bit of code for the last 15 or so years. I've just come back from living in Toronto for a year in Canada. It was a wonderful year, but I'm pretty happy to be back in a place that's about in the 80s and 90s during the day, where I can do things like surf, play beach volleyball. Travel is another thing that I like doing, but it's much harder from here. Anywhere I need to go is about 15 hours away. So I'll still be doing that, but it'll be harder. I'm also a member of this team of that we call the League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates, which kind of started as a bit of a joke name, but then it had legs, and so it started picking up. So you can get a hold of us on Twitter, and also get a hold of me on Twitter, Damo Visa. I'm pretty much always there. If you have any questions or any comments or anything like that about this talk, or pretty much anything to do with Azure or VSTS, tweet at me. I'm on Twitter all the time. So if I don't respond to you in about 24 hours, then it's likely that I'm dead, and you should probably tell my family. They might need to know that I haven't responded. So again, the League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates, you can get hold of us on Twitter, usually using that hashtag. We all follow it, so we watch it. So in that team is Abel Wang, myself, led by Donovan Brown, who many of you may know, Steve Moraski, who used to work for Chef and has come across to Microsoft, and Jessica Dean, who's kind of our DevOps for all things open source, Kubernetes and Helm and all sorts of cool stuff like that. We're also a part of a bigger team of cloud developer advocates, which is close to 50 people at the moment. You can find out all about us there and tweet at us as well. We're at a lot of events around the place. There'll probably be a lot of us at Build, Microsoft Build. And just in case you haven't noticed, that date has been announced probably in the last few hours. So check that out. I can't remember exactly when it is. Yeah. Jeffrey, do you remember?
We can get a quick Google search in a minute here.
Yeah, no problem. But Build will be on again in Seattle. It's been announced for more than a couple of hours now, so it's probably sold out. That's how Build tends to go.
May 7th through the 9th.
May 7th to 9th. Awesome. All right. And if you can't get to Build as well, NDC Minneapolis or Minnesota, one of those. I'm bad at US place names. That is on at about the same time, so that's a pretty good place to get to as well if you can't get to Build. All right, let's get into the real meat of this talk, which is talking about DevOps. So probably the first place to start would be, what is DevOps? So Microsoft has a definition of DevOps, which was written by my boss, Donovan Brown, which is that DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. So there's a few different parts to this, but the two I like to focus on are the fact that it's people, process, and products. If anybody sells you a product and says this will solve all of your DevOps problems, they're probably just lying to you and trying to take your money, right? You can't just buy a product and have that be the silver bullet. You need the people invested in the process and the process to work such that you can actually deliver value to your end users. Everybody's kind of got to be part of this. It's not something that can happen from one place. It's got to be a development team or company-wide mission to implement DevOps. The most important part of this, though, is delivering value to end users. So that means both putting changes and putting new features in the hands of customers as early as possible, but in a repeatable and trustworthy way, so you're actually delivering value. And notice there's no mention of code in this at all. It's certainly not just code. Value could be something like scaling up your web servers when you get a lot of traffic. You know, Black Friday, for example, if you're in e-commerce. So scaling up those web servers is value. Recovering from an outage really quickly is value. Fixing bugs really quickly is value. Or anything that contributes to the value to the customer is what we're aiming for here. So it's not just code, it's all of these things. Another way of thinking about DevOps is kind of this life cycle of delivering this value to your customers. Everything from planning what work you're going to do next, to writing the code or making the changes to infrastructure, testing that stuff, releasing it out to production, and then most importantly as well, monitoring what happens in production and letting that feed back into your planning. It's not enough to just throw it into production and think, well, my job's done now. It's important to make sure that you see what people are doing in production and measure what's happening so that you can feed that back into your planning cycle. So it's not just development and it's not just deployment automation. It's this whole cycle of everything that you do as a company. The next question we often get asked is, why is it important? And I think most people are pretty sold on the idea of DevOps in general, but probably the easiest way to explain this or to sell this to your management is that your competition is probably already doing it. So let's hypothetically say that there's a bug in your production system, but because of your process in your organization, it's going to take you 3 months to get a release out to fix that bug. Meanwhile, if your competition had that same bug, production would be updated in a couple of minutes. They'd fix the bug, push it out. It runs through the whole life cycle and the testing and everything like that. And that bug's fixed immediately. You're going to start losing customers to that competitor. Even if your customer essentially is an internal team, like your
Well. Let's see.
Dan said he lost it, too, so it's not a-
Okay.
Um,
oh, I think I dropped out totally then.
yeah, you dropped out for a bit, but it looks like you're back. That's good.
Okay, am I still sharing? Hold on, I'll do that again.
And you're sharing now. Awesome.
This is one of the challenges of moving back to Australia, everyone. I'm pretty sure what happened then is the tin can and the string that served Australia's internet wasn't stretched tight enough, and so I dropped out. Australian internet is notoriously not very good, so I apologize if I keep dropping out. I should be all right. If we do it too many more times, I will go to my backup internet. All right, where were we? So DevOps is important for increasing velocity and making sure that you can actually respond to issues really quickly and get changes out in production in a trustworthy but quick way. It also allows you to reduce downtime as a result. So if there is a bug, you can fix that bug and push the change out to production rather than having to roll back and work out how all that works. It also reduces human error. Automation is a big part of a good DevOps process. So reducing human error is kind of a side effect of that. It's going to allow you to make sure that anything that gets done to deploy your application to production gets done in a repeatable, trustworthy way. There's no small mistakes that people make anymore because the whole process is automated. With Visual Studio Team Services, this is kind of Microsoft's answer to the whole, the product part of that DevOps definition. And the solution, by the way, if you're using Team Foundation Server, it's exactly the same code base now. So Team Foundation Server is the version of VSTS that you install in your own infrastructure, but it's the same application. Updates are a little bit slower because it is on-premises servers, on-premises applications, whereas Visual Studio Team Services is updated every 3 weeks. There's a major update. However, they can push a new version of VSTS to production inside about an hour, and that's running 70,000 unit tests to make sure that everything's okay and rolling it out through different phases as well. So VSTS and TFS have everything you need for implementing DevOps, taking into account you also need people and process in that. But we're not kind of pushing you to use all of these products. For example, if you want to use GitHub for your source control, no problem. VSTS integrates really closely with GitHub. If you want to use Jira or something for agile planning, that's easy to do as well. If you want to use TeamCity for your builds and Octopus Deploy for your releases, all of that stuff is very easily integrated with VSTS as well. So we're not locking you in to the Microsoft technology. You can use pretty much whatever you want and let VSTS fill the gaps for you. The natural kind of option for deployment and a place to actually serve your software and run your processes is Azure. And VSTS integrates really, really nicely with Azure. And we'll see some of that in a little bit. But that's kind of the best way to go with VSTS. If you're thinking about moving to Azure as well, VSTS is probably the best way to look at deploying your software. It's probably the best way to actually show this is to go and build a pipeline. So let's jump over, and can you let me know, can you see my Azure portal?
We can.
Perfect. That's good. That would have been tricky if you couldn't. All right, so there's There's a new feature inside Azure called DevOps projects. And I have one here, but I'll show you how they're created. If you just search for DevOps projects, this is usually how I get around this search bar at the top, although I could have gone up to create a resource top left there. Let's have a look at services and create a new DevOps project. We can see that I have my DevOps project here, which I actually created in the wrong subscription, which I'll have to fix. So let's add a new one. And what you'll see straight away is that I'm not forced into using .NET. I can also create a DevOps project with Java, static websites, Node, PHP, Python, anything like that. So let's say we did, I don't know, PHP. You can also point at your own code, by the way, and tell it what it is. So, but if we choose PHP, let's say based on Laravel, I've never heard of that before, but sure, let's do that one. And the option for this is deploying on a web app for containers. So this is actually a Linux Azure App Service that'll run a Docker container on top. Let's just jump back a little bit and choose Java, for example. And now if we choose a Spring app, we can have it hosted on a Linux server with containers or on a Windows server as well. Now, what will happen is if I click next and go through this process, it'll build an entire pipeline for me. And it'll create a source code repository for me in VSTS, give me some sample code for that. And it'll create a build definition, a release definition, an Azure App Service, and it'll link the whole thing up together. What you'll end up with, and just because it takes a few minutes just to save some time, here's one I prepared earlier. You'll end up with this single dashboard that shows you everything to do with your CI/CD pipeline. So where the code is, the build definition, and the deployment to my dev environment. The repository is available there as well. The actual website, so the Azure resources that it uses. So let's open that one. And you can see that I created a Node app. So this is a Node.js Express app that's running at the moment. And it's actually running on a Linux app service in Docker. We've also got Application Insights. Not a lot of useful information there. Nobody's really using this demo DevOps project. But that'll allow me to monitor what's going on in that application as well. So all of this is kind of connected. But rather than just click through this one, let's have a look at another one that I created, which is just an ASP.NET full framework application. And it's in source control already. So if we go to our VSTS instance, we can see the code here. There's our commits. I've obviously been playing with this a little bit. So here's our source control, but I don't have a build, I don't have a release, and I'm not hosting this anywhere. So there's a few different ways that people might want to actually deploy this. I'll show you that in a sec, but first let's just create a new website for this to be deployed to. So let's create a new web app, and we'll call it, let's call it DevOps Austin. I will choose this account here, a new resource group, new app service plan, that's fine. I'll leave Application Insights off. I've got another one that can show you Application Insights in a second. And I'm going to leave it on Windows as well. It's ASP.NET full framework, so I don't want to confuse things by trying to run that on Linux. So let's create that web app. And this is basically just an Azure web app or an Azure App Service. It is running on this default service plan, which is an S1 service plan. A service plan is basically how much are you going to pay for this? So you can choose that as well. I just left that at the default. So that's going to spin up. And when I have this Azure App Service, like I said, there's a few different ways that I can deploy to it. One of the most common ways, and this is a real shame, is right-clicking on the project and going to publish. Now, if you've ever heard me say anything to anybody before, you've probably heard me say the words, friends don't let friends, right-click publish. It's not a great way of pushing your code out to production. It relies on me having merged everybody else's code to my machine, run the tests, and them actually passing on my machine rather than me just ignoring them. It relies on the way that Kudu ends up compiling it, and we'll have a look at that in a second. It relies on so many things, and also quite often in companies it relies on a single person being responsible for that. So if Jeff isn't there one day to deploy it, for example, you can't actually deploy to production because his machine is the one that publishes. So that's not a good way of doing it. A better way of doing it would be to build an entire CI/CD pipeline, like we saw with the DevOps project. And thankfully, if you really attach to right-click publish, there is an extension called Continuous Delivery Tools for Visual Studio. And if you install that, it gives you a few different things, but the most useful one, especially for ASP.NET projects, is right-click Configure Continuous Delivery to Azure. And that won't just deploy it to an Azure App Service, it'll build an entire pipeline for you, a continuous build definition and a continuous deployment release definition as well. So that's a good way of doing it. I'm not going to do it that way. We're going to jump straight to the app service that we should have created. And I'll show you a few different ways you can deploy to that Azure App Service too. So probably the most obvious one that jumps out right now is this FTP deployment username, FTP hostname, and FTPS hostname. And it can be pretty, I don't know, tempting to deploy your application just using FTP this way. It's even given me a username. I don't have a password yet. If I wanted a password, I go to deployment credentials and set one there. But again, this is really a terrible idea. I'm still deploying from my local machine, and it's relying on me having merged everything, tested everything, and making sure that everything's okay. Then when I deploy to production, I'm deploying whatever I have. If that breaks production, then production is broken until I can work out what's happening. I don't have a lot of control, and I don't have a lot of opportunity to make sure that things are working before releasing it out to the public. So not a great idea. What's a slightly better idea is this idea of a Git sync. So what this is basically a connection to a Git repository pointing at a particular branch of your application or of your Git repository. And every time there's a commit into that branch, a deployment will happen automatically. Now this is a little bit better because it's not relying on me pushing anything out. Anybody in my team can work together. And as long as your merges are okay and the application will compile and run, then it's a little bit better. It's not ideal, and I'll show you that in a sec, but let's just set this up. So my source is in Visual Studio Team Services, but you'll notice I could put it in a lot of different places, GitHub, Bitbucket. If you're putting your code in Dropbox or OneDrive, that's probably not a great idea. I would not recommend that. You can also have a local Git repository, which means it's an explicit push to an upstream Git repository in Azure. Very similar to an FTP deployment, just using Git. You're basically saying, here's my code, I want to push it up to Azure, but you're doing it with a Git push. I'm going to point at the VSTS instance I have. Yes, we're doing that. MS demos. The project I'm using is this ASP.NET Full project, and I'm in the master branch, which is fine as well. So let's click OK. And what that's doing is it's setting up a synchronization between my Git repository, the master branch, and what actually runs in my application. So if we go to set that up now, if we go to this URL, we're probably still going to get, actually we're probably going to get a loading page while it's doing this sync. Now we've got the default Azure App Service. But if we go to deployment options, we should hopefully see that there's a synchronization in progress now. Now you might be asking, the code is sitting in my source repository here. What's doing the compiling and the deployment? And that's actually quite interesting. There's a thing called, let me just zoom in a little bit. Actually, I'm not sure whether that zoom works. Did that work? Kind of, no? All right. If you go to an Azure App Service and just before the .azurewebsites.net, type in .scm, you get access to this tool called Kudu. Now, Kudu is what takes source code, compiles it, and gets it running on Azure App Service. It does a whole bunch of other things as well, but in this case, that's what we're seeing. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see all sorts of stuff about what's happening in this Azure App Service. If I go to the deployments link down here, I should get a a list of all of the deployments that have happened. And you can see that this one's from VSTS. It happened just now. It's actually already complete. And a few other bits of information there. There's a lot of other stuff you can do with Kudu, but that's what's doing the work behind the scenes. So let's go back to our website. And because this is ASP.NET full framework, it's going to take a few seconds to spin up. But if we come back to our deployment options in Azure and drill into this deployment, we can see exactly what happened. It took 56 seconds to deploy, and here's all of the things that Kudu did. We can see it generating the deployment script and running the deployment command, and even the logs of exactly what happened when it did that deployment. Now, you can actually make changes to what Kudu does to this deployment script and so on, but you're still dependent on every time you push to a particular branch, this just happens. If it breaks the site. You don't have a lot of control over what happens. But we've got our application up there. That's one way of doing it. Now, I'm not against using it this way. I think there's definitely better ways. I would not recommend that as an option. What I would recommend instead, and I've just lost my website, what I would recommend instead is an entire CI/CD pipeline. So I can deploy to different environments, I can run some tests, I can make sure that that's okay, and then promote to my production environment. So I have a test environment, I have a place that I can deploy to, rather than just going straight to production. So let's disconnect this. And that's not going to remove the website at all. It's just going to disconnect this connection, this sync between Git and my application. And instead, I'm going to come down to continuous delivery in the menu there. Now, this will allow me to configure an entire CI/CD pipeline. So if we click configure, we go through many of the same steps. Once again, we're coming from VSTS, but we could come from GitHub or a Git repository. I'm using the MS Demos account, ASP.NET Full project repository, and the branch. We'll just wait for that to work out that it's okay. So that's where my code is. The next thing I need to tell it is what it's actually deploying. So at the moment, I'm deploying a full ASP.NET web application. But again, I have access to ASP.NET Core and Node and PHP and Python and even static websites if I wanted to. So this is just telling the tool what it is my application does, so I know how to deploy it. I know how to build and deploy it. So let's leave it at ASP.NET. If I wanted to, I could set up some load testing. I could deploy to a different slot, which we'll get to in a second. But I'm just going to leave these as default at the moment. So the end product of this is more or less the same thing. Every single time I merge into my master branch, I'll end up eventually with a deployment to this Azure App Service. The big difference here is I have a lot more control over what happens before it gets to production. And we'll build on that a little bit more. I can add new tasks to the build definition. I can add tests. I can make sure it's running tests. I can add different phases to do different things. I can coordinate this deployment with deployments to my database, for example, or to other Azure services, or even to on-premises services. I'm not just deploying from a Git repository to an Azure App Service if I wanted to. If I want to, I can extend that. So this is set it up. Let's have a look at the build definition. And just have a look at what it's done. It's actually running a build at the moment, which is great. So let's have a look at that build definition. If we click on this, we can see, by the way, everything that's happening. None of this is hidden from us at all. These are all logs, just as if you were to run this on your local machine. So you can see exactly what's happening. Let's have a look at what it's set up first, though. So this is the build definition. Just loading now. And we can see all of these steps here. And you get restore, building the solution, running our tests, publishing symbols or debug symbols, and then pushing the built application back to VSTS so that we can use it later on. You'll notice as well that there are a few options. There are a lot of different options along here. So the first thing I want to point out is this agent queue. At the moment, we're using a hosted VS 2017 agent queue. So this is the default option. And it basically means you don't have to install a build agent on your local machine. Microsoft will provide that for you. What happens essentially is a virtual machine gets spun up in the background, and then when your build is requested, you will get access to that virtual machine to build your application. And that's a fresh VM basically for every build, which means that it's good and bad. It means that there's no effects from other people building their application because you've got a fresh machine. But the bad side of that is you also don't get any caching because it's a fresh machine. Right? You can also use hosted Linux ones if you're building Node or something like that, or even ASP.NET Core. You can use Mac OS as well, which is really handy for doing Xamarin builds. And then there's a hosted kind of more lightweight one that doesn't have Visual Studio on it. If you don't want to use those, or if you want to use your own infrastructure as well, you can use a private build agent. And this is just a Windows service essentially, or an executable that you can run on demand that runs on your own machine, whether that's a Windows machine or a Linux machine or even a Mac. And you can use that queue for your builds as well. There's 2 reasons you might want to do that, or maybe 3. One reason is that maybe you need to communicate with something inside your network. And by running an agent inside your network, all of the operations for your build will run on that machine, which means you can reach out to other servers inside your DMZ. The other reason might be you have a tool that you need to rely on that is not on a hosted agent. Maybe you have some Telerik controls or something along those lines that you need to build. You can't install them on the hosted agent, or you can, but it has to be part of your build, and then you'll start paying for the extra time that you take to install it every single time you do a build. It's much easier to have your own build agent that already has these tools installed. The third reason, which is mainly why I use it, is for speed. I have a machine that I've just thrown a whole lot of money at, and it's going to build a lot faster. So I'm going to change to my default queue here. When we get our source control, you can see all of these options that we saw in the tool there, in the wizard. We can pull our code from GitHub or Bitbucket or Subversion. So we're not restricted to pulling from VSTS. We can create a build definition that pulls from a GitHub repository, for example. The other thing is we can do different phases on different agents. We have a lot of control over what steps actually get run. So if I wanted to run a PowerShell script, for example,
You go up top.
I could do that as part of my build. I could add that task. If I wanted to talk to Octopus, for example, there are Octopus tasks that I've installed from the marketplace for Visual Studio Team Services. Get to that marketplace, there used to be a link right at the top or right at the bottom, but I think that's disappeared maybe in my early version. So the easiest thing to do is just go marketplace.visualstudio.com. And you can see all of the different options, including AWS tools. So if you're deploying stuff to AWS, you can add build and release steps and things like that to communicate with AWS. But I'm pretty sure there is, so just looking at build and release, this number goes up every single time. There we go. There's 411 extensions, which add well over 500 additional steps that you can add, or additional tasks that you can add to your build definition. So if you don't want to write the script yourself, you can use one of these extensions. They're really, really popular, really powerful. All right, let's skip out of this and have a look at, I'm going to just save the change I made. Normally you should leave a reason that I saved it there, but I'm lazy. And let's have a look at the summary. We should see that that build succeeded, which is great. And we can see all sorts of details about this build as well. So the fact that it ran for that long, and then links to the actual changes that have been made. Now this is the first build, so it's pulling in all of my changes. And then the fact that it's deployed to this production site. So let's just make sure that that's actually happened, although the code's the same, so we're not going to see any changes. We'll just make sure that it's not broken. And we'll have a look at this release definition. just while that's loading, we had any questions, Jeff?
Let me pull up, and if anybody's watching the Q&A window, you can add a particular question in there and it'll get answered. And there's also the chat window. There's no current questions.
Okay.
in the chat.
Awesome. All right. I'm conscious that I'm kind of speeding through this. This could be a 5-hour talk, by the way. So if there are questions, please pull me up. So this is the release definition. This is what it did to actually release our application. It's a really nice UI here. We've got the drop from our build that is set to be a continuous deployment. So every time there is a new artifact ready to deploy, we'll get a new release happening. It'll do an automatic release to this environment called production, which is a terrible name. So I'm going to call that dev. We don't want to deploy straight to production. That's not a great idea. And in that environment, we have one phase. And again, we can choose the agent that runs on. So let's change that to my default queue just for speed purposes in the future. And there's one step in this deployment process, which is to deploy my Azure App Service. Note that it's already connected VSTS back up to Azure. So we've got the Azure subscription here, the endpoint that's there. If you are using the same account for Visual Studio Team Services as you are for Azure, you'll have all of the available Azure subscriptions as well. So if you were to add this step manually in VSTS, these can be used as connections back to Azure as well. And actually configuring those pretty much requires you just to press the button to say, I want to connect these now. But when you set it up from the Azure side, it sets up a separate service endpoint. Now, the advantage of that is that this VSTS release definition doesn't have permission to deploy to a different web app. That service endpoint here is restricted security-wise to just the things that you're going to deploy to. You can obviously make changes to that service principal in Azure to give it permissions to do more things. But by default, when you set this up, it's kind of minimum required permissions, which is a really, really good way of making sure that nobody can edit your release definition to, delete all of your websites, for example. So you have a lot of control over here. And once again, all of these tasks are available to you as part of your build definition, part of your release definition. So let's just jump back to our pipeline. And we can see that all of these changes, basically the deployment's happened. It's gone all the way through to production. Did I have any unsaved changes? Hope not. It's gone all the way through to production, and production is up and running, which is great, right? But it's not everything. There are some other challenges, which I'm going to get to. The key points that I want you to take away from just that little demo there are that we're not focusing on .NET deploying to Windows. This is any language, any platform. I showed you deploying to Azure, but if you want to deploy to on-premises, that's easy as well. You can set up agents that run on machines and then deploy to those groups of agents running on machines. So if you have a web server farm, for example, of 10 VMs, you can deploy to those 10 VMs just with a single release definition. But if those VMs are Linux VMs and you're running PHP, that also works. The last update I did to the League's website was a change to the UI. I didn't even bother opening Windows for that. It's an ASP.NET Core application, so I used VS Code on a Mac, pushed to Git, went through a PR process, Donovan approved it, and it got deployed out to production. Now that ASP.NET Core application is running in a Kubernetes cluster on Azure App Service on Linux boxes in Azure. Now, this is all done through VSTS, so we don't care what language you're on or what platform you're deploying to. VSTS will be able to actually deploy this. The other thing I want you to notice is there's kind of this scale of bad deployment practices all the way up to good deployment practices. So bad ones can be things like right-click publish, copying and pasting stuff to production machines. And there is a way to do that with Kudu, which I'm not going to show you because it's terrible, but you can just copy and paste to production. You can manually push to a remote Git repository, and then also your manual FTP upload and things like that. These aren't great because they're not repeatable and you don't have a lot of opportunity to fix issues if something goes wrong. Slightly better is this sync with Git. And it's a bit better because you don't have to worry about a single person doing the deployment. If the merge happens into a particular branch, so if somebody commits changes to the master branch, then it will just get deployed. It's also not great though, because I can commit changes that break the compilation and Azure will still try to deploy that application out to production. It'll do a compile. If that compile fails, then I'm not really sure what happens. Or if the compile succeeds, but it's not working, then production's probably going to be broken until I can work this out. So you don't have a lot of control in this respect. Much, much better is to build this entire CI/CD pipeline with VSTS. And that's, traditionally people think of that as quite a challenging thing. Fortunately, you've seen how quick it can be. I think I ran through that in about 10 minutes and I was explaining everything as I went. So building these pipelines is actually quite easy these days. It's not that difficult. Like I said, though, there are still some challenges. And just before we get into those challenges, I think I saw some Q&A here. So I'm popping that up on mine. So
I'll go ahead and read the question out for you.
Yeah, sure.
Somebody had a legacy C++ builder desktop app being extended with WPF, talking to an Oracle database. What would be the best way to work that into VSTS and Azure?
So from the Azure perspective, my guess would be you're going to need to do a kind of a lift and shift thing, which is basically going to be running the same thing on an Azure VM if you really want to get to the cloud. It's probably not going to give you too much advantage apart from maybe not having to maintain the infrastructure for that. I think moving forward into rewriting that is how I would recommend kind of moving forward. If it's that legacy, you can either run it on a VM in Azure or you can, you can start rewriting it. In terms of actually compiling it and deploying that application, VSTS is perfectly capable of building that kind of application and deploying it as well. So you can still use VSTS. You don't have to deploy to Azure. And if you are going to, I think the only way you're going to get that to run is on a VM inside Azure. For Citrix XenApp, I'm not familiar with it, so I'm not exactly sure how that changes the process. It's not a great answer, I don't think, but that's a complicated question.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
I know we're got 12 minutes in our time block, but how does VSTS work with Bamboo or things on the Atlassian stack?
So my feeling is that there's no actual integration directly with Bamboo. However, there are steps that you can add to your build definition to do things like pull some resources from a Git, sorry, not a Git repository, but from a NuGet repository or something like that. So what you could do is have just have a build that doesn't really get sources from anywhere. But then in that phase, in the first build definition, your first task could be pulling the code from Bamboo. So I don't think Bamboo is going to be there. It's looking in the marketplace. Okay, so there's nothing really integrated directly, but you could easily, I think, use NuGet and then call a NuGet pull if you had Bamboo as a NuGet repository. I'm not sure whether that's an option in Bamboo. Or if Bamboo's got an API, you could also connect to that API. I'm actually a little bit surprised there's nothing in the marketplace. I can try and hunt something down if you want me to follow up later, just to see what integrations there are available. Cool.
And that's all the questions that have been submitted so far.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I kind of went through this ideal phase of, our code gets deployed based on committing to master, but there are still some challenges that we want to address here. One of them is the idea of approvals. We don't just want every bit of code that is pushed to our source repository to end up in production. I mean, I've seen the code that I write, and I don't want to do that. I want some kind of governance around that. People to check my code and then some tests in other environments. So that approvals process is important. Downtime is also an issue. While you're deploying, you don't want the application to be down. You want people to still be using it. And then finally, the idea of monitoring what's happening in production and feeding that back into your planning as well. So let's address some of those. With approvals, there's kind of two areas that I want to focus on. The idea of approving code. So rather than automatically just committing to your master branch, being able to have a bit more control over that. So in VSTS, if we come to branches, we can see that we've got our master branch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on these ellipses, and I'm going to come down to branch policies. And what this will allow me to do is to protect this branch. I can set some policies against this master branch, which essentially mean people can't commit directly to master. Instead, they have to go through a pull request process. So in other words, create a branch off my code, make all their changes on that branch, and then submit a pull request. I can put some policies on this, like requiring a certain number of reviewers. I'm going to say I'm allowed one reviewer, and that's actually allowed to be me. By the way, you should probably never check that checkbox. It's just that I'm the only person in this team, so I'm the only one who can do it. You can make sure people put in linked work items. In other words, nobody can actually do work against your code base until it's linked to a particular task that they're supposed to do. That one's really powerful. I'm going to check the check for comment resolution as well, which makes sure that if somebody leaves a comment, I can respond to that comment and say, yes, I have resolved your concern, whatever it was with my pull request. You can also do things like different merge strategies. And I'm not going to do this one, but this is a really, really powerful one as well, a build validation. So I can add a build policy that says, before I'm allowed to merge a pull request back into my master branch, my pull request has to pass this build definition. In other words, I can't merge code into my master branch until it actually builds and runs through tests successfully. Now, this is really, really powerful. Just in case there's going to be a merge conflict or something along those lines, having a policy like this means that that code won't be accidentally merged. It has to succeed. So that's a really powerful one. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do in here, but I'm just going to leave it like that. So I'm just going to show you what that actually looks like. So if I make a change to my application and say for Austin, I will go to changes, change title. Like any good developer, I'm just going to commit and push without even compiling or even saving for that matter. And you should be able to see straight away that it is trying to push that branch to master, and it will fail and give me an error message. It says failed to push the remote repository. And in my output window, it gives me information about why. Pushes to this branch are not permitted. You must use a pull request. So I can't commit this straight to my master branch. There's a bit more control over what happens there. But assuming we get past that code, I probably want some surety on where my code actually goes to. So this release I have here is actually just going to one environment, which I think I renamed dev. There we go. If I wanted to promote that code to a production environment, I can clone that definition and say, right, this is to production. And I might change the tasks, obviously point at a different web app service or something like that. But more importantly, I probably don't want to automatically go from dev to production. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a pre-deployment condition. Now, the one I'm going to add is a pre-deployment approval. So I'm going to enable that, and I'm going to say, I need to approve this deployment to production. Once again, here's a checkbox that you should never change, but I'm going to anyway because I'm the only person there. The person who submitted that release probably shouldn't be the one approving it. And so what this means is before it gets to production, I have to say, okay, this is ready to go. If you wanted to do that in a more automatic way, and this is a new feature called gates, deployment gates, and this is extremely powerful. What this will do, or what this allows you to do, is if you deploy to your dev environment, for example, you can run some load tests, you can run a whole bunch of stuff. You can delay this deployment to production for about 15 minutes. and then only deploy to production once these things succeed. So I can add a whole lot of these gates. I could hit an Azure function to make sure that something is up and running. I can put anything I want in that Azure function to verify that, yes, it's ready to go to production. I could hit an API for the same reason. I could even have a look at Azure Monitor alerts. So if I had some alerts around, performance for particular really important operations, I could have some Azure monitors against those operations that'll raise an alert to say, hey, whatever change you just made to this dev environment has negatively impacted the speed of a particular function. And I won't deploy to production unless there are none of these alerts, unless I've verified that that's going to work properly. I could even make sure that there are no bugs raised against this, against what's happening in dev, for example. And this is really powerful if you have kind of a canary deployment, so a deployment to some users, and then you let them run and you look for these deployment gates. And if they succeed, then you roll it out to everybody else. So that'll all happen automatically if I leave that on. That takes a little bit to set up, so I'm just going to leave that disabled for the moment. So what I've got now is a deployment to that'll automatically happen to my dev environment and then continue on to production. But there's one more thing. We spoke about approvals and also about reducing downtime. I don't want this site to be down while I'm actually doing my deployment. So jumping back over to Azure, there's a really cool feature in here called deployment slots. What this essentially is a parallel website. I'll call it staging, for example, and you can set up as many of these as you want. So there's a staging slot that I can set up. And what that essentially does for me is sets up a parallel application, like another Azure App Service instance, essentially, for my staging website. And I can deploy to this individually. So I might want to point my release definition to deploy to my staging site. And then once I've verified that that works, I can swap these slots over, which means that this is just a DNS swap. So my staging site can be up and running. I can verify that it works. And then I can just start pointing people from the old production site to the new staging site, and it becomes production. So let's make that change in this release definition as well. Let's edit that release definition. And I'm just going to make a couple of changes here.
And
the first thing I'm going to do, oh yeah, sorry.
Whenever you
Was there a question?
there are some.
Okay. I'm going to change this in the background, but so watch along if you want. And yeah, I can answer questions at the same time. I'm just conscious of time, that's all.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes left. So one question is, if there's a build or deploy process that fails or hangs, is there a way to get notified? And also, if the second question is it possible to share environments between release definitions like you do in Octopus Deploy?
Okay, so the first one was, is there a way to get notified if builds and releases fail, or builds and releases processes fail?
Fail or
right? Yes, there is. Hanging, they will fail after a particular time. So there's only a period of time where a build is allowed to continue for. I think it's like half an hour for hosted agents. So you'll get notified at the end of that because it will fail essentially. If it fails individually, like while it's running, then you can set up notifications for that, absolutely. If you go to the cog up there and notifications, you can set things up there. And I think maybe in options, report deployment status, oh no, that's a different thing. There may be something in the actual release definition as well that'll let you do that, but I'm not entirely sure. But over here, notifications, that'll tell you. The other thing is sharing environments between releases. As for like Octopus Deploy, you can definitely do that. If you go to deployment groups, that's where you can set up collections of machines, essentially, and name them different things with different environments and so on. When you have a release definition, you can point at those deployment groups and say, this is my dev deployment group, for example. So you can do that with deployment groups. I'm kind of not covering that simply because it's about Azure here, but deploying to those machines is definitely something you can do, and you can share those deployment groups across releases as well. All right, so let's just, so what I've done in my release definition so far is in my dev environment, I have changed that to point to my staging site. So if we go to dev, this is now pointing at my staging slot. So I'm deploying to my staging slot. I'm running a smoke test and using this really handy feature at the bottom of Azure App Service, which is the output URL. So it'll write to a variable to say, this is where my dev site is. And then I can hit that dev site to make sure that that succeeds. We'll go to production. And instead of deploying an Azure App Service, I'm just going to swap from my staging slot to my production slot. So I'm not actually doing a deployment for production. I have to choose all of these things. I'm not really sure why I have to choose a deployment group, but I do. Sorry, a resource group. The web app that I've got there is in a resource group. So that's just something you have to do. So that process now is a little bit different than it was. I am deploying to a staging slot. I'm running a smoke test to make sure everything's okay. And in real life, you might do a whole bunch of other tests here. And then to go to production, I am deploying, I'm just swapping that slot rather than actually doing any deployment. And that should result in no downtime. So let's tie those two things together. First, I have to change to a different branch so I can make that change. So let's call this DA Brady / Austin change. I'll create that branch and check it out automatically. And then I will push those changes up to the server. So this is basically just creating a feature branch or something along those lines. So my changes now, this ASP.NET for Austin, are now in this branch. I can create a pull request right from Visual Studio, and that'll open it up in the browser. And that's my change title for Austin. So I'm creating a new pull request here. I can link it to work items if I had any. So let's create that. And now you can see some of this approval process happening as well. So over here, all comments are resolved because there are none, but nobody's approved this yet. If I left a comment saying, change this, you'll see that I haven't resolved that comment now. There's something else I need to do before I can merge it. So let's say that's resolved. And then when I approve, all of these policies have been met and I can complete this pull request. So let's complete that. We'll delete the branch because we don't need it anymore. So it'll merge. And if I'm using a different Git flow, for example, I could cherry pick that into another branch, like a release branch, or I could revert it. I can do all sorts of things like that. The actual build definition as well is in progress. So because we've merged into master, we're actually building our application. We're going to start that process of deploying it all the way out to production. So I'm going to let that run and we'll move on. There's only a tiny bit more to show you, and that is the idea of monitoring. How long have we got, Jeffrey?
We have -4 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Can I show this bit or should we skip?
Maybe 2 more minutes.
Okay. All right. Let's just jump straight to the dashboard in Azure. So Smart Hotel is one of these things that we built internally for Connect, just to show a whole lot of information about. It's basically a hotel application that allows you to, that uses cognitive services and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. Really powerful and really cool. Definitely have a look at it. And this is the Application Insights site for that Smart Hotel. So there's a bug in this application, which is basically that it will allow you to say, I want to bring a dog with me, but it won't allow you to say, I want to bring a cat with me. So what we're really talking about here is digging into the server requests and seeing all of the information about what happens, all of the page requests, things like that. I could get to this get upload state page, for example, have a look at all the different requests, and I can see there's a 500 error here. And let's say that's the error that I want to look at, and feed that back into my planning process. So here's all this information. We get calls to remote dependencies. You could see that there was a failure with the call to Cosmos DB here. So I want to create a new work item in Visual Studio Team Services. So I can create this work item saying, you know, cats should be allowed. Well, that's awesome spelling, but I'm going to leave it. And I'm going to assign that to me. So when I create that work item, when I come to the dashboard for this project in VSTS, and I made all those spelling errors deliberately so you could see that, there we go. That was an old one. This cat should be allowed with all my new spellings. That's now a task in VSTS that's assigned to me. I get all of this information to repro it, and I even get, there's actually a weird Chrome bug here that doesn't let me click on that link. So I'm just going to do a sneaky little thing here. I can drill directly into that Azure Application Insights request to see exactly what happened at the time. So I've fed that information about the bug in production all the way through to VSTS, and now I can work on that and get all the information from Azure about what actually happened, the calls to the controllers and things like that. So I can trace that error and do that work. So that traceability is really important. Where are we up to with our release? There we go. We've gone to our dev site, our staging site, but we haven't gone to production yet. And it's saying to me, I need to approve or reject that change. Let's approve. So again, the approvals process is working. If we go to our staging site, that should work. And if we go to the production site, that'll be flipped over with no downtime, which is really handy. All right, so approvals with branch policies, pre-post deployment approvals, so that we did a post-deployment approval, sorry, pre-deployment approval to make sure that I said it's okay to go to production. And those deployment gates are an option as well. Downtime you can reduce by using deployment slots and just swapping when you're ready to go, and monitoring with Application Insights, which could be a day-long tutorial itself about Application Insights. And this kind of completes that circuit of feeding stuff back into your planning. So again, any language, any platform, try and build a CI/CD pipeline rather than doing these other deployments. It'll definitely help with working in a team. Have a look at branch policies, pre and post deployment approvals and gates, using deployment slots and using Application Insights. And I'm aware I'm over time, so thank you, everyone.
Oh, hey, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And for folks on the live stream, thanks for hanging in there. This will be recorded and published online for you to review or your teammates to review. March will bring another meeting of the Microsoft DevOps user group. And so stay tuned. We have several speakers. We're slotting one in for March and one in for April. Those will be published very soon and the announcements will be sent out. So make sure that you have your Meetup account configured for notifications so that you'll get those. And if you'd like to use the discussion forums on the Meetup group as well, those are operational. Again, thank you, Damien, for getting up so early and presenting to us from Australia, and for Microsoft for sponsoring the lunch here on site in Austin, and then also Clear Measure for the location sponsorship. And everyone have a great day, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.